The lawyer's voice cracked as he announced the numbers. 80% of the billion-dollar Hastings fortune would go to Maya Richardson. The maid, Richard Hastings' widow, screamed, lunging forward with accusations of theft and manipulation. His 3 children joined the chaos, their faces twisted in disbelief and rage. But Maya stood frozen, trembling, because she had no idea why her employer had done this. She didn't know the secret he'd carried to his grave. None of them did. Not yet. If this story grabbed your attention, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next emotional drama. Comment below and tell us where you're watching from. We love hearing from you. Hit that like button if you're hooked, and share this video with someone who loves powerful stories. Now, let's dive into how it all began. 5 years earlier, Boston, Massachusetts. Maya Richardson stood outside the massive iron gates of the Hastings estate in Beacon Hill, her worn resume clutched in sweating palms. The September wind carried the scent of old money and privilege through manicured hedges that probably cost more than her entire childhood home in Dorchester. She'd applied for the housekeeping position 3 times before finally receiving a call back, and now her heart hammered against her ribs like it was trying to escape. At 24 years old, she'd been cleaning houses since her mother Teresa died 2 years ago, leaving behind nothing but medical debt and a photograph of a man whose face had been carefully torn away. Maya had learned to survive on her own, taking whatever work she could find, never asking questions about the life her mother had lived before her or why she'd raised Maya alone, without ever mentioning a father. The mansion rose before her like something from a movie, all white columns and floor-to-ceiling windows that reflected the autumn sky in ways that seemed almost offensive in their beauty. Maya's sneakers felt too loud against a marble driveway as she approached the front door, where a stern-faced woman in a gray suit waited with a clipboard and an expression that could freeze water. Mrs. Patricia Hastings, the lady of the house, examined Maya with the kind of look that lingered too long on her dark skin and second-hand blazer before moving to her credentials with obvious skepticism. The interview lasted exactly 12 minutes, most of which involved Patricia explaining the standards expected in a Hastings household and the absolute discretion required when working for one of Boston's oldest and wealthiest families. Maya nodded at everything, swallowing her pride, because she needed this job more than she needed dignity. Richard Hastings appeared in the doorway near the end of the interview, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis in ways Maya couldn't understand. He was 58 years old, silver-haired and distinguished in a way that suggested boardrooms and country clubs and generational wealth, but something in his blue eyes shifted violently when he looked at her. His face went pale, almost gray, and he gripped the doorframe like he might fall, his mouth opening and closing without producing sound. Patricia barely noticed, still detailing the cleaning schedule and expectations in her clipped, cold voice, but Maya saw the way Richard stared at her like he'd seen a ghost. He looked haunted, devastated, like something from his past had walked through his door wearing her face. Maya felt uncomfortable under his gaze, wondering if she'd done something wrong, if he was about to tell his wife not to hire this girl who'd somehow triggered something terrible in him. But Richard didn't reject her. Instead, he cleared his throat and said quietly that Maya seemed perfectly qualified, even recommended, and that Patricia should hire her immediately. His wife looked surprised by his sudden interest in household staff, but she nodded and told Maya to start the following Monday at 6 in the morning. Maya left the estate confused but grateful, not understanding why the man of the house had intervened on her behalf or why he'd looked at her with such raw emotion. She didn't know that Richard had spent the rest of that day locked in his study, staring at old photographs of a woman named Teresa Richardson, comparing features and timelines and wrestling with a suspicion that would soon become devastating certainty. She didn't know he'd already decided to hire a private investigator to dig into her background, to confirm what his heart already screamed at him. Maya started work that Monday, arriving in darkness to begin her duties in a house that had more rooms than her entire apartment building back in Dorchester. The Hastings family consisted of Richard, his wife Patricia, and their 3 children, all of whom were younger than Maya, though they'd never know it. Brandon was 25 and working at his father's investment firm, already developing a gambling problem that Richard kept bailing him out of with increasingly harsh arguments. Melissa was 22 and fresh out of college, Spending her days shopping and clubbing and cycling through boyfriends like accessories she could discard when they no longer serve her image. Jason was 20 and still finishing his business degree at Harvard, the quietest of the three, spending most of his time at school or locked in his room. They moved through the house like royalty, barely acknowledging Maya's presence except to leave messes for her to clean or make requests delivered like commands. Within 3 weeks, Richard's private investigator delivered a report that confirmed his worst fears and explained his deepest guilt. Maya's mother had been Teresa Richardson, the black woman Richard had been engaged to 30 years ago, the woman his family had rejected because of her race, the woman he'd abandoned under family pressure even though he'd loved her desperately. The investigator had discovered that Teresa died 2 years ago, leaving behind a daughter whose age matched perfectly with when Richard had last seen her, when he'd walked away from their relationship, not knowing she was pregnant. Richard ordered a DNA test, secretly collecting a sample from a glass Maya had used, and when the results came back confirming she was his biological daughter, his firstborn child, he locked himself in his study and wept for hours. His daughter had been working in his home, serving his legitimate family, cleaning up after children younger than her, and she had no idea who he was. Richard's behavior toward Maya changed after the DNA confirmation, though he never found the courage to tell her the truth directly. He watched her with a mixture of guilt and wonder and grief that confused everyone, especially his wife, who started making accusations about inappropriate interest in the help. He asked Maya careful questions about her life, her mother, her childhood, each answer wounding him with the reality of what he'd done by abandoning Teresa. He left generous tips for her work, far more than necessary, trying to compensate for 30 years of absence with $100 bills that felt obscene in their inadequacy. Once, he'd reached out and touched her shoulder gently, apologizing for things Maya couldn't understand, and she stepped back uncomfortably, making him look devastated. Patricia noticed everything, her suspicions growing, her comments becoming sharper about how Richard seemed obsessed with the maid, but she never imagined the truth. 3 months before Richard's final days, Richard Hastings collapsed in his study on a Tuesday afternoon in June, his heart giving out after years of guilt had slowly poisoned it from the inside. Maya found him sprawled across his mahogany desk, his face gray and his breathing shallow and labored, and she'd scream for help while calling 911 with hands that shook so badly she could barely hold the phone. The ambulance arrived within 7 minutes, paramedics rushing Richard to Massachusetts General Hospital while his family scrambled to follow in their expensive cars, suddenly reminded of their own mortality. Maya rode in her old Honda, not knowing if she should even go to the hospital. But something pulled her there anyway, some invisible thread she didn't understand connecting her to this man who'd been inexplicably kind. The doctor stabilized Richard, diagnosing him with severe coronary disease and giving him months at best, maybe a year if he was extraordinarily lucky and changed everything about his lifestyle. The family hired private nurses for Richard's care home, transforming one of the mansion's guest rooms into a medical suite, complete with monitoring equipment and oxygen tanks. But Richard kept asking for Maya, requesting her presence in ways that drove Patricia to barely conceal fury and made the children exchange confused glances. Maya would sit with him sometimes when her regular work was done, reading to him from books he loved, or just keeping him company in comfortable silence that felt strangely natural. He talked during those visits, rambling stories about his youth and his regrets, mentioning a woman he'd loved once and lost through his own cowardice, though he never said her name or gave Maya enough details to understand he was talking about her mother. Once, he grabbed her hand tightly and told her she reminded him of someone beautiful and strong who deserved so much better than what life had given her. Richard's health deteriorated rapidly through the summer, his body shutting down faster than anyone expected despite the best medical care money could buy. He spent his final weeks in bed, surrounded by lawyers and accountants who came and went with documents requiring signatures, legal arrangements that Richard handled with unusual urgency. Patricia tried to control access to her dying husband, but Richard insisted on private meetings with his attorney Theodore Morrison, sessions where he dismissed everyone including his wife, leaving them confused and suspicious about what he might be planning. The family whispered among themselves about whether Richard was changing his will, whether he was making arrangements they hadn't approved, but none of them imagined the truth. Richard was preparing his final act of justice and confession, the only way he knew to make amends for abandoning his firstborn daughter 30 years ago. Richard died on a Thursday morning in early September, exactly 5 years after Maya had first walked through his gates seeking employment. She'd been cleaning the kitchen when she heard Patricia's scream echo through the house, that primal sound of loss that transcends class and privilege and reduces everyone to the same desperate grief. Maya ran upstairs with the other staff members, finding Richard still and peaceful in his bed, his face finally free of the guilt that had haunted it for so long, especially these last 5 years. Patricia collapsed across his chest, sobbing dramatically while Brandon, Melissa, and Jason stood frozen in shock, their father suddenly and irrevocably gone, leaving them to face a world without his money and influence protecting them. Maya stood in the doorway, tears streaming down her face for reasons she couldn't fully articulate, grieving for a man who'd been kind to her when the world rarely was, not knowing he was her father. The funeral was scheduled for the following Tuesday at Trinity Church in Copley Square, a massive affair befitting one of Boston's most prominent business leaders and philanthropists. Maya debated whether she should attend, wondering if it was appropriate for her household staff to show up at such an event. But Richard's attorney, Theodore Morrison, called her directly and insisted that Richard had specifically requested her presence in his final instructions. The phone call felt strange and too personal, but Maya agreed to come, buying a simple black dress she couldn't really afford and taking the train into the city on the morning of the service. The church was packed with Boston's elite, senators and CEOs and society figures filling the pews while photographers captured everything from a respectful distance outside. Maya slipped in quietly, finding a spot in the back where she wouldn't draw attention, watching as Patricia and the children sat in the front row looking appropriately devastated in their designer mourning clothes. After the service ended with its generic praise for a man nobody seemed to really know beyond his wealth and business acumen, Theodore Morrison approached Maya and several other key individuals, informing them that Richard's would be read immediately in the church's conference room as per his specific instructions. Maya was confused, asking quietly why she needed to be present at such a private family matter, but Morrison insisted it was required, that Richard had made very specific arrangements that included her. She followed the family into a wood panel room where Patricia and her children took seats around a large mahogany table, their faces tight with anticipation and barely concealed greed. They clearly expected to hear about their inheritance, mentally calculating how they divide Richard's estimated billion-dollar estate between them, already making plans for expansions and purchases and a lifestyle they continued to enjoy. None of them paid any attention to Maya, who stood awkwardly near the door, wondering when she'd be dismissed so the real business could begin. Theodore Morrison opened his briefcase with hands that trembled slightly, removing a thick document that represented Richard Hastings' final wishes and the bomb he was about to drop on everyone in that room. He explained that Richard had updated his will 3 months ago, right after his diagnosis, and that everything was legally sound and properly witnessed by multiple parties who could testify to Richard's sound mind and clear intentions. Patricia nodded impatiently, gesturing for him to continue, her fingers already adorned with her late husband's family rings, her expression suggesting she was merely tolerating necessary legal procedures before claiming what she believed was rightfully hers. Morrison's professional composure cracked slightly as he began reading, his voice clear, but strained under the weight of what he had to announce. The room fell into expectant silence, everyone waiting to hear their names and their shares, having no idea that their entire world was about to shatter in ways they couldn't begin to comprehend or accept. The truth revealed 1 week after the funeral, 80% of my entire estate, including all properties, investments, business holdings, and liquid assets, I leave to Maya Richardson, Morrison read, and the room exploded into chaos before it even finished the sentence. Patricia's scream could probably be heard throughout the entire church, a sound of pure rage and disbelief that made Maya physically flinch backward toward the door. Brandon lunged across the table toward Morrison, demanding to see the document, insisting there had been some terrible mistake or outright fraud that needed to be corrected immediately. Melissa burst into tears, not from grief but from fury, her face contorted with hatred as she turned to stare at Maya with venomous eyes that promised violence if given the opportunity. Jason sat frozen with his mouth open in shock, unable to process what he'd just heard, his mind refusing to accept that the maid, the black woman they'd barely acknowledged for 5 years, was inheriting their father's fortune. Patricia was on her feet immediately, pointing at Maya with a shaking finger, hurling accusations of manipulation and seduction, calling her a thief and a whore, and worse things that Morrison had to shout over. Continue reading. Morrison raised his voice over the chaos, continuing to read through the shouting and accusations that filled the conference room like poison. The remaining 20% will be divided equally among my wife Patricia and my children Brandon, Melissa, and Jason. Additionally, the family home will remain with Patricia for her lifetime, after which it will transfer to Maya Richardson. The lawyer's words barely registered to the noise, through Patricia's continued screaming about lawyers and lawsuits and criminal investigations. Melissa had actually rushed toward Maya with her hands raised like claws, stopped only by Jason finally moving to grab his sister's arms and pull her back before she could commit assault. Brandon was threatening Morrison directly, promising legal action and personal destruction, his face red with rage that made the veins in his neck stand out prominently. They all wanted answers that Maya didn't have, explanations for why their father had betrayed them so completely, reasons for this impossible situation that made no sense according to everything they believed about their world and their place in it. Security had to be called to escort the Hastings family out of the church, their screaming echoing through the holy space like blasphemy against everything the building was supposed to represent. Patricia swore she'd fight the will with every resource available, that she'd prove Maya had manipulated a sick and dying man, that justice would be served no matter how long it took or how much it cost. Brandon grabbed Morrison by his suit jacket, threatening criminal investigations and promising to destroy everyone involved in this travesty, his hands shaking with barely controlled violence. Melissa spat actual saliva toward Maya as security pulled her away, her pretty face twisted into something ugly and unrecognizable, all her privileged beauty stripped away by pure hatred. Only Jason remained relatively calm, though his eyes held deep accusation and confusion as he looked at Maya one final time before following his family out, clearly wondering what kind of person could do something like this. Maya stood alone in that conference room with Morrison, her entire body shaking so badly she had to grip the back of a chair to stay upright, tears streaming down her face because she genuinely had no idea why Richard had done this to her. The week that followed was the longest and strangest of Maya's life, filled with investigation and revelation that would change everything she thought she knew about herself and her place in the world. The Hastings family hired an entire team of private investigators and attorneys, determined to find evidence of wrongdoing, something concrete they could use to overturn Richard's will and restore what they believed was rightfully theirs by blood and marriage. The lead investigator was a former FBI agent named Marcus Webb, thorough and ruthless in his approach, digging into every aspect of Richard's final years and searching for proof of Maya's manipulation or undue influence over a dying man. But instead of finding evidence against Maya, Webb discovered something else entirely in Richard's private safe, documents and secrets that had been carefully guarded for 30 years, hidden from everyone who thought they knew Richard Hastings. Webb found DNA test results dated from 2 years ago, scientific proof of a biological relationship between Richard Hastings and Maya Richardson, results that explained everything and simultaneously destroyed the family's entire understanding of who their father had been. Webb found old photographs of a young black woman, beautiful and radiant, her smile captured in images labeled with dates from 30 years ago and a name written on the back. Teresa Richardson, Richard's fiancée. He found love letters that Richard had written but never sent, declarations of devotion to a woman he'd abandoned under family pressure, confessions of cowardice and regret that filled dozens of pages with guilt and longing and apologies that came 3 decades too late. He found Richard's private journal from the last 5 years, detailed entries about the moment he'd realized Maya was his daughter, the devastating recognition when she'd first walked through his gates seeking employment, the guilt that consumed him every single day afterward. Richard had written about watching Maya work in his home, his firstborn child serving his legitimate family, cleaning up after children younger than her, living in poverty while he lived in luxury built on the back of his own moral failure and cowardice 30 years ago when he'd chosen family approval over love. When Marcus Webb presented his findings to the Hastings family in their attorney's office 1 week after the funeral, the revelation shattered them in ways the will reading never could have accomplished alone. Patricia's face went white as she realized her husband had loved someone before her, had been engaged to and abandoned a pregnant black woman to marry within his race and class. choosing social acceptability over genuine love. Brandon, Melissa, and Jason learned they had an older half-sister, a woman who'd been serving them for 5 years while they treated her like she was beneath them, invisible and unworthy of even basic human kindness or acknowledgement. The family sat in stunned silence as Webb laid out the evidence, the timeline, the truth of Maya's identity as Richard's firstborn daughter, abandoned before birth and denied everything that should have been hers by right. Morrison contacted Maya that same afternoon, asking her to come to his office immediately, saying it was time she learned the truth her father had tried to tell her through his will. Maya arrived with trembling hands, and Morrison gave her the letter Richard had written, along with the DNA results and photograph of a mother she barely remembered, Teresa Richardson smiling in Richard's arms 30 years ago. She opened the envelope with shaking fingers and began to read her father's final words, his confession and apology, his explanation for why he'd given her everything he could no longer give in person. He'd written that he couldn't give her the childhood she deserved, couldn't give her his name or his presence or his love when it mattered most, but he could give her his fortune and hope that somehow, in some small way, it might begin to balance the scales of justice that he'd tipped so unfairly against her from the moment of her birth, and maybe, just maybe, she could forget him even though he didn't deserve it. 2 months after learning the truth about her father, Maya sat in Theodore Morrison's office and made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She instructed Morrison to transfer 10% of her inheritance to Jason Hastings, reducing her share from 80% to 70% while increasing his portion significantly. Morrison asked if she was certain, reminding her that Jason had been part of the family that treated her poorly for 5 years, but Maya insisted, explaining that Jason had been the only one who occasionally thanked her for her work, the only one who'd shown even the smallest shred of human decency during her time in that house. She told Morrison that she couldn't change the past or fix what Richard had done 30 years ago, couldn't undo the pain her mother had suffered or reclaim the childhood she'd lost, but she could choose who she wanted to be moving forward. Jason received the news with tears and profound gratitude, later reaching out to Maya to apologize for his family's treatment of her and to acknowledge her as his older sister, the only member of the Hastings family who would ever speak to her again. Maya accepted his apology with cautious grace, knowing that forgiveness was a process, not a destination, and that some wounds would take more than money to heal, but at least now she had the truth, her father's final gift, and the financial freedom to build whatever life she chose on her own terms.